Welcome to the Catalyst Sale Podcast with Mike and Mike. Sales is a thinking process. This podcast will help you learn about what works in sales, how to hone your skills, and increase your success. I'm your host, Jody Mayberry, and I'm here with Mike Simmons. How are you doing in Arizona, Mike?
Jody, I am doing fine in Arizona, and by the time this thing goes live, it will no longer be 110. It will probably be 75 to 80 degrees. So I will put myself in the mindset of 75 degrees and getting ready for Thanksgiving.
Well, there we go. Well, also on that same note, all the fires in the state of Washington will probably be extinguished, which is certainly going to be a good thing. I think half of our state is on fire.
Well, my sister-in-law lives in Oregon and around Mount Hood, and they've got fires going on too. Some kid is launching firecrackers or something like that, has burned however many acres of land, and they're actually evacuating homes within about 3 miles of their house. So something we're monitoring and kind of keeping track of and getting updates via text on from her. But it's crazy. I mean, again, when this will kind of show how we try not to timestamp these things, but we're recording in September. Irma has got Florida in her sights. Houston is underwater. And, in Arizona, all we've really got to deal with is the heat.
Yes. Well, here in the Northwest, everything from Portland to Missoula, Montana seems to be on fire right now. But you mentioned we try not to timestamp these episodes. We've done so with this one, but it gives me a good segue because some things are timeless, Mike. And one of those things I think is timeless is Zig Ziglar. Now, I know you're familiar with Zig, Mike. I got to see Zig Ziglar live, many years ago in Peoria, Illinois, and it put me on a Zig Ziglar kick for years afterwards. And then I had kind of moved on, hadn't thought about him for a while, and I met someone from the Ziglar company recently, which re-inspired me to start listening to Zig Ziglar again and read some of his books again. And it just made me think about this because he's really known in the sales world, except maybe I'm wrong, but I think up and coming salespeople now, they may not know Zig, but the people they learn from all learned from Zig. So how important do you think that these old people that taught the foundations like Zig Ziglar, how important are they?
I think old people are important because without old people, we wouldn't be here.
Well, that's a fact. That's a fact. But that's, I don't mean old as in age. I mean old as in Zig's wisdom is timeless and he's not with us anymore, but his lessons are. I don't know how often they're actually tied back to Zig any longer.
Well, it's and I forget the quote, and I butcher these things from time to time, and I butcher these quotes almost as poorly as I butcher the movie quotes that I bring out. But somebody said that there are no new ideas or there are no new concepts. Most of these ideas, most of these thoughts have been conceptualized, and it was through poor execution, lack of familiarity that these things didn't come to fruition. Uber was not the first ride-sharing capability or thing that was going to unseat taxis. There was another product that came out before it. Facebook was not the first social platform. You had MySpace before that. And now I'm going to start sounding like one of those get off my lawn kind of people because I don't even have a lawn. I live in Arizona. It's granite, but get off my rocks. There are so many new technologies that are out there that everybody's using. And the way that I keep track of them is they pop up in our iTunes account because my son downloads them onto his phone. So there's some new technology that'll come out that we'll become aware of. But you bring things back to the timeless classics. There are some amazing quotes that you can go back to that Ziglar has put out there. Goals enable you to do more for yourself and others too. True success has more components than one sentence or an idea can contain. And honesty and integrity are absolutely essential for success in life, all areas of life. The really good news is anyone can develop both honesty and integrity. So these are timeless quotes. In presentations that I've delivered, I tend to lean on the Virgil quote and this one's been butchered over time, depending on how you translate it, but fortune favors the bold. So yeah, I think it's important for us to reflect on those timeless classics. And for those who are reflecting on those timeless classics, it's important for us to give proper credit, because if we don't give proper credit, those things will get lost.
Well, to go with that, the focusing on timeless classics, we're in an age where there's new apps coming that will help. We've talked about many of them on the show. We've talked about technology, how it helps, how it gets in the way. With all of that coming and here, and gosh, I'm sure there's stuff coming you and I haven't even imagined. How important is it to look back to the fundamentals of selling?
Well, here we go. Another quote. What is it? Those who don't study history are damned to repeat it, right? So, if you don't go back through and constantly, and again, this is going to be one of those episodes where it's just going to be filled with bad or poorly referenced quotes. But what's the Abe Lincoln quote? If I've got 3 hours to cut down a tree or 2 hours to cut down a tree, I'm going to take the first hour and 45 minutes or 2 hours and 45 minutes to sharpen the axe. If you don't go back and continue to sharpen that axe or sharpen that saw, you increase your risk and decrease the potential for success long term. So to get back to your question, I think it's critical to go back and learn from those who have walked the path before and constantly restudy those scenarios. I mean, there are a couple of books that I have that I'll refer back to from time to time, whether it's a Drucker book or whether it's Cialdini's book on influence, or a number of other ones that are out there. And I'll put some links into the notes on this podcast on some of those readings. But I think it's important to continue to go back and learn from those who have gone through the path before. Because if you take the path of trying to learn on your own all the way through, you've inserted significant risk. Yeah,
you mentioned the Robert Cialdini book. I went through a spell of probably 4 or 5 months where I got that book on Audible, and then I would listen to it once a month until I started to understand some of those better. Well, you mentioned that book. Are there any other sources you would recommend new sales professionals go to, or people that just want to reconnect with the fundamentals? Are there any other sources you would point them to refocus on fundamentals?
Well, because we're here listening to the podcast, I would expect you've already found us. So I would ask you, the listener out there, to share the podcast with others in your network and your community and continue to spread this message. We try to refer back to those fundamentals consistently. Beyond that, and the promotional plug aside, I think looking at podcasts or listening to podcasts is a really interesting way to gather that historic information. I know, Jody, you and I have talked about Dan Carlin's podcast. It's escaping me, the history.
Hardcore
history, which is just amazing. And for a podcast to suck in my attention for the amount of time that he can do that, talking about history is pretty amazing. And I'm a history buff, so it tends to tug on a couple of those strings. But I think going through and doing podcasts, I think going through and doing search, traditional Google search, I think asking leadership inside your organization is really important. Like, one of the questions you can ask a leader inside your organization, or more of a seasoned sales rep, is, how did you cut your teeth in sales? Like, where did you first learn about how to sell effectively and what works in sales and how to improve your success? What do you wish you would have had, looking back on the last 5 years or 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, what do you wish you knew then that you know now? And where did you get that information from? And through those questions, I think you can gain access to different ways that a rep was influenced. So the book that I kind of cut my teeth on in sales was Beyond Selling Value. And it was back when I was at a company called SmartForce. And this was the methodology. It's a consultative sales, solution selling approach, very customer-oriented, customer-first approach. And for those who are a little bit older, it might have been Spin. For those who are a little bit younger, it might be Challenger. But what you'll find as you go through these books, and whether it's Jeffrey Gitomer's book on sales, or it's Zig Ziglar's content, or Dale Carnegie content, you'll find that there are some common threads throughout, some basic tenets. And those basic tenets are: start from the perspective of your customer, understand what's important to people, act with a high level of integrity. It's critical to build trust over time. People buy from those who they trust and those who they like. And by going back and listening to those books, whether it's books on tape, way back in the day, I guess we had books on cassette tapes where you could kind of stick a cassette tape in. And there was this thing called a cassette tape. You'd stick it into your Walkman. And it was really cool when you had those Walkmans that would automatically flip the recording without you actually having to take the tape or the cassette out. But we were really dating ourselves. Like, we went way past CD-ROMs and DVDs and MP3 files to books on tape. So ask, like anything else, just ask those around you. You know the people that are around you that have gray hair. You know the people who around you who don't have any hair. You know the people around you who've got a lot of wrinkles. If they have wrinkles, they have gray hair, they don't have hair, they probably have gone through some pretty interesting life lessons. And if you ask the right question, I'm sure they're happy to share.
Yeah, I love that, Mike. I hadn't even thought of that in the context of this episode until you said just ask the people around you. That is a great source of the fundamentals. And really, not enough people ask the older people around them about lessons and fundamentals or their story. Just people don't ask enough. So most of them would be pleased to have the opportunity to help someone out that's younger. So that is a great way to start. And your reference to books on tape, and we're talking about Zig, he used to say, now, of course, he spun it into a long story because that's how he is. But he used to say he would not take $100,000 for his cassette player if it meant he couldn't replace it, because everything that went into his head that led to him making more money, serving more people, came as a result of his cassette player. Now, that dates him. Nobody talks cassette player these days, but it shows the importance Zig placed on learning, using he used to call it Automobile University, I believe. And now we can do it through podcasts. And Zig used to also say you should listen to the same thing 16 times because that's how many times it takes for you to understand what you're hearing. So that's I guess a kick there from Zig to show how important he felt the fundamentals were. You find one and you listen to it over and over until you understand it. And if you want to introduce yourself to Zig, there's 2 books. One, if you're interested in selling, and you probably are, I would do Secrets of Closing the Sale. That is a great one. I think in that he identifies 101 ways to close a sale, which is very interesting. And then the other one, a more motivational book, is See You at the Top. That's a great one too. So there's a couple of places to get started with Zig. Now, Mike, I've mentioned Zig a lot. Is there anybody from your past, one of these old founders of this sort of material that you listen to or used to read?
Yeah, for me, more reading. And I've gotten more into, with Audible, I've gotten more into listening to books. I listen to a lot of podcasts. So and my podcast listening is a couple of times. It's when I'm walking the dog and when I'm at the gym. And so I've got a limited time period where I'm doing it. Or if I'm on an airplane and I'm flying someplace, they'll have that kind of playing in the ear. So it's commute and gym time. So today it's podcasts like the Tim Ferriss podcast. It's the Jocko Willing podcast. It's the Lee Cockrell podcast, Creating Disney Magic. But when I think of books and those books that are on the shelf someplace or in a box someplace in the house, and some of them I've repurchased on my Kindle so that I can keep them with me on my phone. It's the staples. It's Drucker. It's Maxwell. Most of the content that I consume today is more about leadership and empathy and working with people rather than going back and learning how to sell. That's not an area where I spend a lot of time. And maybe I should. I mean, maybe this is a good reminder to me that that's something I've got to go back and sharpen my axe or sharpen my saw and read some of Zig's content. I mean, even just since we've been talking, I pulled up a couple of his quotes. Another one that is really great. And these concepts are really strong, and you can speak in the tone of quotes, but your attitude, not your aptitude, will determine your altitude, which is really a profound idea and concept. And when you think about the importance of mindset, and you think of the mindset of the people who work for you, who are part of your team, and you think of your own individual mindset when you go to work, I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to see how quickly I can screw this day up. And yet, as sales leaders, many times what we're doing is we're looking at the detail of the data on the number of calls that somebody makes or the number of opportunities that they're working on, and I'm wondering, what the hell are they doing? Why aren't they out there doing their job? Why aren't they talking to customers? Don't just look at the data. Start having conversations with your team. Ask questions. But back to this, the folks that I would tend to go back to, Drucker and Maxwell, some other books that I will continue to read from time to time come from people like Brian Tracy, Eat That Frog. You hear us refer to it often, Covey and the 7 Habits. And then you've got Seth Godin and some of the great content that he's put out there, whether it's Purple Cow or even his startup podcast, which is awesome. It's 15 episodes. I keep it on my phone and when I'm in a bind or a mental block, I will turn on one of those episodes, depending on where that bind is or where that mental block is, just to kind of free ideas and free thoughts.
Yeah, that podcast is so good. 15 episodes that I'm guessing is 3 years old, 4 years old by now. And it still is consistently ranked one of the top business podcasts in iTunes. It's incredible that it's just spread word of mouth, and the information in there is so foundational. We're talking about going back to foundational content. Information in that is so foundational. People keep coming back to that.
One of the things that kind of comes to mind as we're talking through this, Jody, is who are the new leaders in this type of content? When my kids have kids and their kids have kids and their kids have kids, if we're still having kids, that far into the future. But if that's happening, who are they going to look back to 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 100 years ago, and say, wow, those were some of the people who created some of the foundational information. They shared some of these new ideas and concepts. They challenged thought to the point where they've accelerated progress. Now, I wonder if some of those will be people talking about podcasts and how that medium for communication, or YouTube videos, or you think of just the different ways to consume it. But who are those leaders today, the ones that you see out there in the marketplace who are putting good content out there that you follow?
My goodness. I hadn't thought about it in that way. And Zig Ziglar was one of the first ones to start selling cassette tapes at the back of the room at his presentations. And so he really set that form of media and learning off in a whole new direction. And I think you're right. There's probably people that are doing the same right now, and we just don't realize it. I don't anyway, because I hadn't thought of it in that way. But I look at some of the people that I follow right now that as I teach people, I can point back and say, look, these are the people I learned from. You may be learning from me, but of course, Lee Cockrell is one. Yep. He's a big influence for me. But there are others like Ray Edwards for copywriting, Dan Miller, the author of 48 Days to the Work You Love. He's been a big influence on me. Michael Hyatt, who he's also got a podcast and books and online content. So much different than just being an author, just being a speaker. The way content gets out there now, all these people that I've mentioned have moved beyond just writing a book or just presenting content from stage. It is now the videos and podcasts and online content.
Yeah. And, as you talk through it, people that come to mind for me, Tim Ferriss, that's one of my favorite podcasts out there. And it's all interview based. There are a couple of episodes where he'll answer questions, listener questions, and kind of share his experience, and which is cool, which are cool to listen to. But what I really like is how he takes this focus of deconstructing success, identifying key trends, implementing those key trends to accelerate your own personal success. So if you're not listening to the Tim Ferriss podcast, that would be one that I would recommend. They're just some great interviews. Hal Cussman. Joe, did you know?
I don't on this one. So
he's a great storyteller. It is one of my favorite episodes of the Tim Ferriss podcast. I'll put a link to that one. But I'd like to hear from the community here at large. Who do you recommend? Who are you listening to? Who would you like to hear on the podcast if we reach out to them? We've had a number of guests on recently, and those have been some really popular podcasts. We're happy to have them on and have a discussion with them about how they learn, where they've learned, what they're applying, what's changing in their roles, how they're improving customer success, because that's our focus here, is how do you improve customer success? Because if you're improving success on the customer side, my expectation is that you're going to improve success in your business side. The revenue will come, the sales will come, the growth will come.
That's so good. And as we wrap this, I'm going to tie it back to Zig one last time, because Zig used to say, you can have anything you want in life if you help enough people get what they want in life. So that's just one of the foundational aspects of all of this, Mike, that if you help enough people get what they want, you can get what you want. And it is about serving, and that can be presented in a lot of different ways, but it still is an old foundational thing that has been out there forever. I mean, look how old the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People is. That is a really old book, but that's what it's about.
But people still go back to it. So, as you talk about it, another Zig quote that comes to mind is, if you can dream it, then you can achieve it. You'll get all you want in life if you help enough other people get what they want, which really ties into the concept that you were just describing. And if Disney has the quote out there, if you can dream it, you can do it. One of the retired colonels that I used to work with, who has been a mentor to me, would talk about the concept of conceive, believe, achieve. You've got to first conceive the idea or the thought, conceptualize that, hey, this is something we can accomplish. You've got to believe that you can actually do it. And at that point, you can put yourself on the path to achieving and executing. You can't just start executing without some kind of vision. Or, if you start executing, you might find that you're moving yourself down a completely different path. So like that, like it goes on many of these podcasts, we went down multiple paths. We talk about Zig, we talk about foundational skills, we talk about some of the other people that have influenced us. And again, look forward to the feedback from the audience.
Yes, there we go. So final reminder, who do you think is one of the people now putting out foundational content that 20 years from now we'll look back and say they had a big influence on what we're doing? So Mike would love to hear from you on that. And you can send your comments to Mike at hello@catalystsale.com or on Twitter @CatalystSale. Mike, as we wrap this up here, give me your final thought on foundational content.
Those who don't study history are damned to repeat it. And if you don't learn from those who have walked the path before, you are setting yourself up for a high level of risk and potential failure. By learning from multiple sources, you can take the combination of all of the brushstrokes you can pull together from each of those sources and come up with your own ideas, thoughts, and concepts. And that's where innovation happens.
All right. Thank you, Mike Simmons. And thank you for listening to the Catalyst Sale Podcast.